Iwo Jima, March 1945. A Japanese soldier crouches in a bunker carved from volcanic rock, his hands trembling as he writes what he knows will be his final letter home. But it's not death that terrifies him, it's what comes before it. The Americans, he scrawls in shaky characters, they do not fight like men. They fight like machines that feel nothing. For over 1,000 years, Japanese warriors had embraced death in battle as the highest honor. The samurai code of Bushido taught that dying for the emperor was life's greatest purpose. Yet by 1943, something unprecedented was happening across the Pacific theater. Veteran Japanese soldiers, men who had conquered China, crushed the British at Singapore, and humiliated America at Pearl Harbor, were beginning to fear their American enemies more than death itself. What could possibly shake the resolve of warriors trained from birth to welcome their own destruction? The answer lies not in American weapons or tactics, but in something far more psychologically devastating. Something that would break the spirit of an empire built on honor, ritual, and the sacred art of dying well. December 7th, 1941. As the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But Yamamoto's concern wasn't shared by his fellow officers or the men they commanded. After years of crushing victories across Asia, Japanese forces believed they possessed something their enemies lacked: the spiritual strength to accept death without question. This wasn't mere bravado. The Japanese military had spent centuries cultivating what they called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, a warrior philosophy that viewed death in battle as transcendence, not tragedy. Every soldier carried into combat the collective weight of ancestral honor, the emperor's divine blessing, and the unshakable belief that dying for Japan guaranteed eternal glory. American forces, by contrast, seemed spiritually hollow to Japanese eyes. They came from a nation of merchants and movie theaters, where individual comfort mattered more than collective sacrifice. They fought not for ancestral honor or divine emperors, but for abstract concepts like freedom and democracy, ideas that seemed weak, even laughable to warriors raised on Bushido. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had helped plan the conquest of Southeast Asia, wrote in his diary that Americans were soft men from a soft country who would break like rice paper when faced with true warrior spirit. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to confirm this assessment. At Bataan, at Wake Island, at the Dutch East Indies, American forces crumbled before the Japanese onslaught. But by late 1942, disturbing reports began filtering back to Tokyo from the front lines. At Guadalcanal, American Marines weren't just fighting, they were learning. And they were displaying something Japanese commanders hadn't anticipated: a cold, methodical approach to warfare that seemed to strip away all emotion, all honor, all humanity from the act of battle. What the Japanese military was beginning to encounter wasn't American weakness. It was American pragmatism, weaponized for total war. The first cracks in Japanese confidence appeared in the jungles of Guadalcanal, where Marine Corps General Alexander Vandergrift was implementing a revolutionary approach to Pacific warfare. Unlike the rigid, honor-bound tactics Japanese forces expected, American units began displaying an unsettling adaptability that defied every assumption about Western fighting spirit. Japanese officers had been trained to recognize patterns in their enemies. The British fought with disciplined formations. The Chinese relied on overwhelming numbers. The Dutch crumbled under pressure. But American forces seemed to operate by different rules entirely. They showed no concern for glorious charges or honorable defeat. Instead, they treated warfare like an industrial process. Identify the problem, apply overwhelming force, move to the next objective. Private First Class Eugene Sledge would later describe the Marines' mindset. "We weren't heroes, we were technicians of death, and we got better at our job every single day." This clinical approach to combat began to unnerve Japanese veterans who had grown accustomed to enemies who shared their concepts of martial honor. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. American forces didn't just kill Japanese soldiers, they made them disappear. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves, names erased from captured records, entire units simply vanishing from the historical record. To warriors who believed that dying nameless and unremembered was the ultimate dishonor, this systematic erasure of identity was more terrifying than any torture. But it was in the realm of firepower where American pragmatism truly revealed its horrifying efficiency. Japanese forces had been trained to endure hardship, to overcome material disadvantages through spiritual superiority. They could handle being outgunned. They had been outgunned before and won through superior will. What they couldn't handle was being systematically, remorselessly crushed by forces that seemed immune to human emotion. American artillery didn't bark and growl like the guns they knew. It whispered death from distances so vast that retaliation was impossible. 24 liberators appeared at altitudes where they looked like silver specks, dropping payloads with mechanical precision before disappearing into empty sky. Naval bombardments lasted not for minutes or hours, but for days, turning entire islands into moonscapes where nothing could survive. Captain Tamichi Hara of the Japanese Navy wrote after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, "The Americans fight like they're machines, without passion, without anger, without mercy. They simply calculate and execute." How do you maintain warrior spirit against an enemy who treats killing like accounting? By 1944, Japanese military psychiatrists were reporting unprecedented numbers of soldiers suffering from what they called American sickness, a condition characterized not by cowardice, but by the complete inability to comprehend an enemy that seemed to exist outside the natural order of warfare. These weren't soldiers breaking under fire. These were warriors whose entire worldview was being systematically dismantled by forces they could neither understand nor counter. February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most brilliant military minds, had spent 8 months turning 8 square miles of volcanic rock into the most sophisticated defensive network in human history. 22,000 Japanese soldiers waited in caves and tunnels, prepared to kill and die in numbers that would shock America into negotiating peace. Kuribayashi understood his enemy better than most. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, traveled from coast to coast observing American industry and culture. He knew the invasion was coming, and he knew his men would die to the last soldier. But he also believed that if he could make the Americans pay a high enough price, if he could fill enough body bags and telegram enough families, he could break their will to continue the Pacific campaign. What Kuribayashi didn't anticipate was how completely American forces had evolved since Pearl Harbor. The Marines who stormed Iwo Jima's beaches weren't the same forces that had struggled in early Pacific battles. They were veterans now, hardened by 3 years of island warfare, carrying weapons and tactics specifically designed to kill Japanese soldiers as efficiently as possible. The flamethrower teams moved through Kuribayashi's tunnel networks like industrial exterminators, sealing cave mouths with napalm and pumping carbon monoxide into ventilation shafts. Combat engineers used shaped charges to collapse bunkers, then bulldoze the rubble flat, not to clear the position, but to ensure nothing and no one survived underneath. Demolition teams carried satchel charges specifically designed to penetrate reinforced concrete, turning Kuribayashi's fortifications into tombs. But it was the systematic nature of the American advance that broke something fundamental in Japanese resistance. There were no heroic charges to repel, no moments of tactical brilliance to exploit, no opportunities for the kind of spiritual victory that Japanese warriors craved. Instead, American forces advanced like a machine, grinding forward regardless of casualties, replacing losses immediately, treating each death as acceptable overhead in a larger industrial process. Sergeant Major Kanehiko Ando wrote in his final diary entry, "They do not hate us. They do not fear us. They do not even see us as human. We are simply obstacles to be removed, like rocks blocking a road. There is no honor in fighting ghosts who feel nothing." The breaking point came when American forces began using captured Japanese equipment against its original owners. Radios crackled with familiar voices speaking perfect Japanese, calling out false orders and spreading disinformation. Captured uniforms were used to infiltrate defensive positions. Sacred items, family photos, memorial tablets, personal letters, were stripped from corpses and used as psychological weapons against survivors. To Japanese soldiers raised to revere their ancestors and honor their dead, this desecration was worse than any physical torture. They weren't just being killed, they were being erased, their very existence made meaningless by enemies who treated sacred objects like battlefield debris. General Kuribayashi sent his final radio transmission to Tokyo on March 17th. The enemy's strength is not in their weapons or their numbers. It is in their absolute indifference to everything we hold sacred. They fight without souls, and how do you defeat an enemy that has no soul to break? 36 days after the invasion began, organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima ceased. Of the 22,000 defenders, only 216 were taken alive. But among those who survived, military interrogators documented something unprecedented. Japanese soldiers who expressed not shame at their defeat, but relief that the fighting was over. The psychological impact of Iwo Jima rippled through the Japanese military like a shockwave. Veteran officers who had conquered half of Asia began requesting transfers away from Pacific assignments. Training camps reported unprecedented desertion rates among recruits designated for island defense. For the first time in modern Japanese history, soldiers were choosing execution for cowardice over deployment against American forces. Emperor Hirohito's military advisors found themselves confronting an impossible reality. The warrior spirit that had sustained Japan for 1,000 years was crumbling not under the weight of defeat, but under the crushing realization that their enemies were operating by fundamentally different rules. American forces didn't seek honor in battle, they sought efficiency in killing. Intelligence reports from surviving officers painted a picture of American military capability that terrified the highest levels of Japanese command. These weren't just superior numbers or better equipment, these were forces that had industrialized warfare itself. American replacements arrived faster than Japanese forces could kill them. American supplies appeared in quantities that defied comprehension. American tactics evolved with each battle, incorporating lessons learned at the cost of Japanese blood. But most disturbing of all was the Americans' apparent immunity to war exhaustion. Japanese strategists had counted on battle fatigue, on war weariness among American civilians, on the natural human reluctance to continue fighting after absorbing heavy casualties. Instead, American forces seemed to grow stronger and more ruthless with each engagement, as if combat losses only refined their killing efficiency. Dr. Rikihei Inoguchi, a military psychiatrist treating Japanese veterans, documented a condition he called mechanization syndrome, a profound psychological break that occurred when traditional warriors encountered industrialized warfare. Patients described nightmares where they were being processed through factories, fed into machines that methodically dismantled their bodies, while American technicians took notes on efficiency improvements. The Japanese government began preparing for Operation Downfall, the anticipated American invasion of the home islands, with unprecedented desperation. Every civilian was to become a suicide bomber, every child a soldier, every inch of sacred Japanese soil a killing ground. But privately, military leaders harbored growing doubts about whether even total national sacrifice could stop forces that seemed immune to traditional concepts of human warfare. General Korochika Anami, Japan's war minister, confided to his diary, "We taught our soldiers to embrace death, but we never taught them how to fight enemies who have embraced emptiness. How do you maintain warrior spirit against forces that treat killing like bookkeeping?" By August 1945, Japanese military hospitals were reporting unprecedented numbers of soldiers suffering from what modern psychology would recognize as anticipatory trauma. Psychological breaks triggered not by past combat experience, but by the mere prospect of fighting American forces. These were warriors trained from childhood to welcome death in battle, now paralyzed by the fear of facing enemies who seemed to exist outside the natural order of warfare. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended World War II, but they also obscured a more subtle victory that American forces had already achieved. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese military had been psychologically defeated not by superior firepower, but by encountering enemies who fought without the emotional and spiritual constraints that had defined warfare for millennia. In the post-war interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers, a disturbing pattern emerged from interviews with surviving Japanese veterans. When asked about their most frightening combat experiences, prisoners consistently described not specific battles or weapons, but the gradual realization that their enemies felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction in victory, no grief over losses. "They killed us like farmers harvesting rice," recalled Lieutenant Hiroshi Onoda, who spent 30 years hiding in the Philippine jungle rather than surrender to forces he considered more terrifying than death itself. Efficiently, methodically, without emotion. "We were not their enemies, we were their crop." This psychological transformation hadn't been planned by American strategists. It had evolved organically from 3 years of Pacific combat, where survival demanded the systematic suppression of traditional human responses to warfare. Marines learned to kill without anger, soldiers learned to watch friends die without grief, commanders learned to sacrifice units without remorse. What the Japanese perceived as inhuman coldness was actually the ultimate adaptation to industrial warfare. The irony is profound. Japanese forces had spent centuries cultivating the warrior spirit, believing that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. They encountered American forces who had accidentally discovered something far more powerful: the ability to wage war without spirit at all, treating combat as a technical problem to be solved rather than a spiritual contest to be won. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story lies in what happened after the war ended. American veterans returned home carrying the same psychological conditioning that had terrified Japanese soldiers. The efficient, emotionless approach to problem solving that had won the Pacific War didn't simply disappear when the shooting stopped. It became part of American culture, shaping everything from corporate management to Cold War strategy to modern military doctrine. The Japanese soldiers who feared fighting Americans more than death may have sensed something their own commanders missed: that they were facing not just a more powerful enemy, but a preview of warfare's future. A future where victory belongs not to those with the strongest warrior spirit, but to those most willing to abandon their humanity in service of efficiency. Today, military historians debate whether American forces in the Pacific truly fought without emotion, or whether they simply became expert at channeling human feelings through industrial processes. But for the Japanese soldiers who faced them in battle, the distinction was meaningless. They had encountered something that violated every assumption about warfare, honor, and human nature, and it broke them more completely than any defeat in battle ever could. The question that haunts military philosophers to this day is whether the Americans won the Pacific War by becoming something more than human or something less, and whether, in learning to fight without souls, they lost something essential about what it means to be warriors at all.